My name's Jesse Bellemare. I'm a plant ecologist at Smith College in the Department of Biological Sciences. I'm standing on a hillside here in Conway, Massachusetts this morning to talk about a habitat type, a vegetation type here in Massachusetts that I'm very interested in and excited about. These are rich mesic forests. It's a distinctive community type that you find in western Massachusetts, particularly western New England. And we're here this morning to look at a couple examples of this habitat type, talk about its environmental setting, what phenomena produce these vegetation types, and a little bit about the unique species that grow here. This is a forest type that's very typical of western New England, western Massachusetts, in places that have calcium-enriched bedrock, like marble or limestone. You can see some ledges in the background of where I'm standing here. And parts of that bedrock include calcareous marble that is eroding and dissolving in rainwater and groundwater to release calcium. And that mineral is elevating the soil pH of this habitat down the whole slope here as the water seeps down across the ledges and enriches the soils here. This is a site that has high pH soils, and that high pH tends to create increased fertility. And you can get a sense for that just by the very lush vegetation here in the understory. These are all herbaceous plants, so they're not woody plants. They're plants that grow from scratch every spring. The very abundant one here is blue cohosh, Caulophyllum filictroides. It's very typical of this site, might even be considered an indicator species of rich mesic forests in western New England. And it's a very sort of dramatic, very colorful species. The flowering has already taken place earlier in May and April. So blue cohosh is one of a large number of plant species that are typical of these rich mesic forest habitats. Many of the plants that grow here actually emerge and flower very early in the spring. So this plant has already flowered. It's starting to develop fruits. Many of the other species that you find here, like trillium, trout lily, squirrel corn, a number of plants are referred to as being spring ephemerals, which emerge very early in the spring before the forest canopy leafs out, at a time when the light levels here in the understory of the forest are very high, and there's a lot of water availability and nutrients because it's early in the spring and leaf litter is decomposing from the previous fall. So if you find these sites in the spring, they tend to be carpeted with small flowering herbs. Again, trout lily, squirrel corn, wild ginger, a number of plants that flower very early in the season. And by midsummer, some of the larger statured ferns and plants like blue cohosh become most dominant. But if you search around on the ground below this herbaceous layer, you'll find the remnants of these very early flowering plant species that have already died back for the year. So they're only photosynthetically active for 3 or 4 weeks in the early spring. One of the interesting features of that is that those plants are so short that they don't have a lot of options for dispersing their seeds. And so one of the characteristics of these spring flowering plants that come up very early in the season is that many have seeds dispersed by ants. They have small capsules that open on the ground and release seeds into the leaf litter. They're sort of invisible to birds, which are up in the canopy. Wind dispersal is not a great option because these other larger plants have grown up already. And so these plants tend to have little seeds that are moved around by ants in the understory. And they might move a few feet at a time, maybe 10 or 15 feet. But it's very typical of this community type to have plant species that disperse very slowly and move very slowly. And so one thing that makes this community type special is that where you find it, it tends to be located in very old, stable forest habitats. And it takes a long time to redevelop this vegetation type once it's been disturbed by human activity. The plant species move slowly. Many of them are very slow growing. And so locations where you find this sort of assemblage of plant species tend to be places that have, for whatever reason, sort of escaped deforestation and agricultural land use or other development in the past 200 years during the period of settlement and development of the hill towns here in western Massachusetts. Okay. Okay, and in terms of environmental threats to this habitat type, these rich mesic forests that we find in western Massachusetts and western New England, one of the things that's on people's radar is, not surprisingly, invasive species. These habitats are very fertile and productive, and so they are interesting targets for invasive species. So we find a number of plants that are not native to the Northeast that turn up in these forest habitat types. The barberry, Berberis thunbergii, is a fairly common exotic species that turns up in these habitat types. It hasn't become a massive problem here, but it is widely scattered in these forests. There's more concern about things like garlic mustard, which is making its way into the hill towns where many of these habitats are located. The one thing going for these forests is that many of them tend to be a little bit more remote and not quite as fragmented as areas further east in Massachusetts or New England. And so the opportunities for invasive species to get into these forest types has been a little bit more limited. Over time, though, that sort of distance effect might wear off, and it's probable that many of these sites will be more invaded by exotic species. One of the other interesting aspects of this forest type is that it is a sort of a northern example of what is a much more widespread forest type in eastern North America. So the rich mesic forests that we're talking about here this morning are sort of a northern variant of what's been called a mixed mesophytic forest type, which continues all down the southern Appalachians into North Carolina and Tennessee, those areas. And so many of the plant species that we see here today, the native ones, you would also find in rich forests in the southern Appalachians. However, as you move south, you get an increasing diversity of species south of New England. And so it's possible that in coming decades, some of those species that are currently restricted to areas in the south may start to migrate north, and this habitat type is one that potentially would be a host for many of the plant species that are typical of the southern Appalachians. So looking into the future with these rich mesic forests, there's sort of two things going on with species that are not here presently. The exotic species moving into the region, and then also the potential for southern species to be migrating north into this habitat type. So it's likely that these communities will continue to change into the future as the environment changes and more exotic species enter the region. Okay, and in terms of my own personal interest in these forest types, and in the rich mesic forest in particular, this is a community type that I've had a connection with for many years. Done research in these forests for over 10 or 15 years, but also just a long-term interest in the plant species that grow here. These habitat types are very rich. They're very charismatic in the sense that, you know, after a very long winter, this is the forest type where you can go early in the spring to see a lot of wildflowers coming up and blooming early in the season in late March and April. So they're attractive for a lot of botanists and people who are interested in getting outdoors early in the spring and seeing some plant life. And so from an early age, I've been coming out to these types of habitats to look for spring plants, even do some spring foraging for wild leeks, which are a very common plant species in this area. So it's an exciting community type. It's very diverse and lush, and compared to other forest types in this area, tends to have higher diversity of plants. And so botanically speaking, it's a very interesting habitat to work in.